This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. Around 400 BC, a great swathe of Western Europe, from Ireland to southern Russia, was peopled by one civilization. Perched on the northwestern fringe of this vast Iron Age culture were the British, who shared many of the religious, artistic and social customs of their European neighbours. These customs were Celtic, and those who made up this civilization were the Celts. The Greek historians who studied and recorded the Celts' way of life considered them to be one of the four great barbarian peoples of the world. The Romans wrote vivid accounts of Celtic rituals, including the practice of human sacrifice, presided over by druids, and the tradition of decapitating their enemies and turning their heads into drinking vessels. But it seems that their apparent lust for violence was accompanied by a love of poetry and beautiful art. How far should we trust written sources of the classical historians in their writings on the Celts? And what can we learn from the archaeological remains that have been discovered in this country? With me to discuss the Celts in Britain are Barry Cunliffe, Professor of European Archaeology at Oxford University and author of, among others, Facing the Ocean; Alistair Moffat, writer and historian and author of The Sea Kingdoms, The Story of Celtic Britain and Ireland; and Miranda Aldhouse-Green, Professor of Archaeology at the University of Wales, Newport, and author of Dying for the Gods. Barry Cunliffe, let's start at the beginning. What do we mean by the term Celts, and where did that term itself, that name, come from?
Well, I think what we've got to do is to realise that the term Celt means something different every time it's used, really. And if we start from the beginning, the first time we see the word Celt used, it's being used by the Greeks to describe barbarians in northwest Europe, basically.
What date
Greeks about the 5th, 4th centuries BC.
Yeah.
They're saying that those people up there are barbarians. They're different from the ones in Africa. They're different from the ones in the east. So let's call them Celts. So it's a general term for northern barbarians. And
so just think, does Celt mean anything? Does the Greek word Celtoid, does it mean anything?
It can. It's variously interpreted, but it probably just means a sort of other peoples or something of that sort. It's very difficult to get at that one. And when we come on a bit later, people like Julius Caesar are being a bit more specific. They're saying in Gaul there are people who call themselves Celts, and they actually, he gives some geography, they live more or less between the Garonne-Gironde axis and the Seine, so they're sort of central Gaulish. But what no one ever does is to say that the people who live in Britain are called Celts. What we can say is that, there, as you said in your introduction, there is this shared belief system and shared value system over large slabs of Europe from the east of Europe right across to Ireland. And languages are similar across those areas. But we can't say that every one of those groups was called Celt.
When the Greeks called them one of the four great barbarians, or Persians, Africans, what did they mean by the term barbarians? Is this just non-Greek or non-Roman, or did it take us any further? Because as we're going to discover, they're far from barbaric in the normal painted savage sense, although the normal painted savage comes into the descriptions, I think.
Indeed. No, I think what the Greeks were meaning were people who didn't speak Greek, people who made these unrecognisable sounds like ba, ba, ba. You know, it's a derogatory term. People who are other than us, basically. And that's what we get the whole time. In the classical writers, the Greek and Roman writers, it's the stereotype of the other. So we are stable, civilized people, ordered people. They are the opposite. They are unstable. There is no order there, and so on. So it's like a caricature. What the classical writers tell us is the caricature of the Celts, but like all caricatures, there's an element of truth in it.
So up there, meaning up from Greek and Roman, I mean, in northern, northwestern Europe, there are these people called... But we're not talking about a unified lot. We're talking about lots of different tribes, aren't we?
Yes, we're talking about a very large number of different tribes, hundreds of different tribes. We know the names of some of these different tribes, and some are more like each other than others. But Celt is a good general-purpose term for lumping them all together and saying something of value about the similarity of people up there north of the Alps.
Miranda Aldhouse-Green, Barry Cunliffe said that has referred to the dispute it may be, or difficulty it may be, about referring easily to the British as Celts. Could you develop that?
Yes, I think so. I think what Barry's getting at is something which is very true, and that is that if we look at the classical writers, of whom about sort of 30 or 40, you might mention the ancient Britons, there is no source which actually mentions the Britons as Celts. I mean, Caesar, for example, writing in the mid-1st century BC, calls them Britanni. They're never called Celts. Caesar does say that he noticed great similarities of attitude and customs between the southeast British and the Gauls, but that's as far as we get in terms of getting close to being able to call the Britons Celts. So there is this problem. People who are arguing against the use of the term Celts are worried that by calling Britons Celts and everybody else Celts in Europe, you're kind of ironing out differences and getting away from the fact that there's tremendous regional diversity in Europe from about the 5th century BC, or in fact, of course, even earlier. But there are so many differences that some people wonder whether it's at all useful to use this blanket term, because it is, in a sense, homogenising the past. And I think that's what causes the problem. The other thing about calling Britons Celts is that that opens the way for people who wish to make a direct link between past Celts and present Celts. Because the term Celtic is used for people living on the western periphery in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall and so on, and because Celtic languages are known about and people identify themselves as Celts, living in these peripheries now, it's easy then to elide backwards to say, oh yes, the British Celts, they were there in the Iron Age, they're the same Celts as the Welsh and the Irish and the Scottish now, and that of course is nonsense. But the use of that blanket term tends to make that kind of homogenising process, which I think is academically a bit suspect.
Well, where does that take us then? I mean, are we talking now of the British... When I say British Celts, am I talking incorrectly? Or am I talking about a degree of difference too far, as it were? The finch that became a non-finch in Darwinian sense. You hop over the channel and suddenly they're having this much the same sort of traditions, and we find very similar this, that and the other, but they're not Celts. Because Caesar and the other 39 classical writers don't call them Celts, they are not Celts. I mean, do we stop the discussion and start talking about something else, or can we still use the word Celtic to get us into this? Can you briefly on that, because Alistair's champing to get in.
Yes.
Alistair Moffat. I mean, all of your... I mean, yeah, fine.
I think that the term can be used. I think we need to be sure of what we're talking about. We need to be sure of our definitions. I think it's fine to use the term Celt for the Iron Age past and even for Iron Age Britain, as long as we know what we're saying. What I think we do need to be clear about is that if we're using the term Celt for the Iron Age past in Britain, that if we're using the same term to discuss 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century identity in the north and west of Europe, we're not necessarily talking about the same thing.
Well, I mean, this programme rarely comes as close to home as the 18th, 19th, 20th century. Those are very, very difficult waters for us to get into. Can we just flip back 2,000 years where we're much more comfortable? Alistair, what is your, well, not reaction, but what's your view on this British Celt thing? What I want to do is to clear up a sort of platform, so because we're going to discuss the British Celts, so we need to call them something else, but talk about what was going on then around the turn of the millennium from 200 or 300 BC to 200 or 300 AD, that kind of thing.
I mean, I'd be happy to call them hobbits or Daleks or Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons. I don't really care. But what I think is going on here is a very interesting historical three-card trick. I've looked at 2,500 years of Celtic history in Britain and Ireland, and basically in a rapid sketch the pattern is dead straightforward. Military defeat, colonisation, marginalisation, pastiche, led by Walter Scott, a fellow borderer, shortbread tins, tartan and all the rest of it, and now, hey guys, we don't exist. So that's what's going on, it seems to me. It's a more subtle removal of our history than in the past, but it's a removal nonetheless. And Miranda's contention that to talk of British Celts in 1 AD and 2001 AD as being unconnected and characterising that as nonsense, I think is amazing, frankly. Of course they're Celts. Of course they share a cultural coherence all down the west of Britain. The most important and interesting thing, I think, from my point of view in this discussion, is that these languages still exist. They don't exist anywhere else in Europe. Celt-Iberian, Lepontic and Gaulish, all these European Celtic languages have died. They're still alive here. Related languages are still alive here.
The Scottish Gaelic, the Irish Gaelic, the Welsh.
Welsh, Manx and Cornish. And they hold inside them 2,500 years of history. There's no question about that. They're the most important surviving artefact, if you like. And the difficulty, of course, is that so few people who claim that the Celts don't exist don't understand these languages. They don't read them, they haven't learned them, and so on. So in a way, it's easy to claim that. So I would rather, as you say, get over that, put it to one side. We'll call them hobbits or whatever you like.
No, I'm not onto hobbits. So let's
call them Britons.
But my point is dead straightforward. These peoples have a great deal in common, not only their languages, not only their geography, but also their history. And that history has had a great deal in common with itself, I suspect, for a very long time.
Would you like to come back on that brief, either of you?
I'd quite like to come back on language, because I think I share your view on this, that the people who speak a common language have got a common are likely to have a common identity. So I'm very happy with that. But we talk about the Celtic languages in the West. We've got to remember what we're talking about. We're talking about a concept that developed in 1700 by the director of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. We're not talking about anything of reality. He could have called the languages of the West, he could have called them Atlantic, which I think we would have done now, rather than Celtic. He only called them Celtic because he was making a preconceived jump. And we call them Celtic now. Fine. They are languages which were spoken by the Celts in Central Gaul. So I've got no problem with that. But we just have to be slightly careful about how we use our arguments. I don't disagree with you at all.
But you can see where these post-imperial jitters come from.
Sure. I can indeed.
Here we are, having our history taken, our name taken away from us. No, thank you. I won't accept.
No. I would go back to the point we started with, that the Celts are constantly being reinvented and remodelled. And what we have now in our concept of Atlantic Celts is the most recent remodelling of a concept that started 1,000 years BC.
Can I just move you? Well, say what you want, then I'll ask my question.
I was just going to say a little bit about language, because one of the problems about languages is that it's difficult to trace them back into prehistory. But we do have sets of place names, normally encapsulated in Roman writings and geographies and so on, which do show that over this vast swathe of northern Europe, there are commonalities of place names which you get popping up again and again, whether you're in Ireland, whether you're in Scotland, whether you're in Gaul or Eastern Europe, or even in parts of Turkey. Places like the Nemeton names, Nemeton meaning sanctuary or sacred place, Briga, Dunum, these are fortified places. These you do find in Spain, in France, in Eastern Europe and so on. And that is, and in Cumberland, indeed. And that, of course, is a very unifying thing. So, I mean, in a way, we can take language backwards. What we can't do necessarily is to say a great deal about what people were speaking in the 5th century BC. We just don't really have the evidence.
OK, we're going to stop that for a moment, if you don't mind. Can I finishing off this first part about the Celts, Miranda, and then briefly, we're going to come to sort of rather caricature stereotypical descriptions, we may think of them. But one of the things that interested me, I might have learnt it at school or something, but until I went back I didn't really, is the technological authority that they had. They were talking about people who worked wrought iron, which was difficult to work, and so on. The technological basis of their society gives them, in my view, a kind of force that they stop being scavenging tribes just jumping on horses every 10 seconds.
They are tremendously sophisticated in terms of the technology, both in terms of iron and wrought iron, and in terms of art styles. And art is, I think, one of the most important keys to trying to get a handle on unified groups of people. The art styles, the techniques of working bronze and iron are absolutely superb, even noted by the Romans as being absolutely second to none.
Yeah, but I'd just like to continue the technology. We'll come to that in a minute. Alistair, this does put a different cast on them. If you have a technology, if you have to cut down all this woodland, you have to make all this stuff, you have very, very highly skilled people, you have to have settlements in a very strong way. This is where the stuff is made, and so on. It's a different... for many people listening, I'll think, well, as I did, vaguely unaware of all that.
Oh, there's no doubt it's a sophisticated culture, and I think it's that sophistication in the production of the items that Miranda mentioned which actually drives the expansion and the spread of these languages, in my view. I think that Celtic languages spread through trade, through the fact that these people who spoke these languages in Central Europe had the grip of this technology and were able to take with it their language. I mean, it's a process of acculturation, if you like, that goes on. I mean, I guess a good analogy is the internet. I remember a piece in The Independent a couple of years ago where Hamish McRae talked about English being driven by the internet. And I think to a degree, Celtic languages in Europe were driven by this metal technology, which was so advanced. I mean, they made stunning weapons. I mean, what's the slashing sword called? The Spatha and so on, which has a razor edge to it because they can hone it to an amazing sharpness. Now, if you're a cavalry warrior and you've got a slashing sword that will cut like a razor, well, you want one.
Well, there's masses of illustrations with swords in your books, Barry, aren't there, which are wonderful.
Yeah. Can I just take up Alistair's point and come back to the swords in a moment? Absolutely right. I would argue that the Celtic language evolved as very much a lingua franca for trade and exchange, and not just trade and exchange of materials, but of ideas and technologies and belief systems. And that's why the language as a unifier has got to be seen alongside technology and belief systems.
Can we just stick with the technology?
Yeah, OK, technology. One thing that I love of Celtic work is the barrel. Now, just a little bit of technology. To be able to shrink an iron hoop onto a barrel is a pretty gee-whiz bit of technology, and to be able to do that onto a spoked wheel. And they could do that to perfection as far back as the 6th century BC. And the chances are that a thing like the barrel was actually invented by the Celts.
Yes. Now, can we have a sort of general agreement that we'll call the British Celts the British Celts? We'll call them the British Celts. Is that around the table? Do we have a little consensus here?
Absolutely.
All right.
We have one vote for, one. We have an all right, a kind of bit of a shake of a head, and one for.
Mine's got inverted commas around it. How about
that? Well, we'll call them British Celts, absolutely.
Okay.
Right, all right. Now we're talking about tribal lives here in these islands, aren't we, Barry Cunliffe? Can you give us some idea of the shape and size of the tribes?
We only know about the tribes as tribes, really, from the 1st century BC. Because it's then that they begin to mint coins, and we can find their tribal names and plot the distributions and find the capitals. And they were, at that stage, really quite small. Colchester, for example, capital of one of the tribes, Catuvellauni, more or less Essex and into Hertfordshire. The Atrebate is based on Silchester, pretty well Hampshire with a bit of Berkshire thrown in. It's that sort of thing. What is particularly interesting, I think, is that many of these tribes at that stage map on more or less to the English county. I'm not suggesting continuity, but that there is a unit of government there that makes sense.
What size are we talking about? Are we talking about 400 people, 4,000 people, 40 people? What
Very, very difficult to say. If we just take population as a whole, I think we've underestimated population of the island as a whole, and many of us now would think perhaps 2 million in the Iron Age is not at all excessive. So we might be talking about tens of thousands in some of these slightly larger tribal groups like the Catuvellauni.
And the hierarchical structure, was it, did we have the three-class system, as it were?
We can get at this through the archaeology to some extent. If you look at the burials in the southeast of Britain, you can see that there are kingly burials, you can see that there are rich burials, which might be sort of elite chiefdom burials, and then you can see those lower down with just mirrors or swords in, and those lower down still. You can recognise in the burial
those
evidence...
who didn't even get in.
Those who are scattered to the winds,
left where they fell.
Literally scattered to the winds. But 4 or 5 sort of grades you can recognise in the archaeological evidence. So this is likely to be a reflection of a fairly structured society. And the Roman writers, looking back on this period, talk about kings and warring kings and so on. And some of these people actually do call themselves kings on the coins.
One thing that struck me about Caesar's remarks, Miranda Oscar-Green, was that he said common folk commit themselves in slavery to the nobles. And one of the 3 great exports of the British Celts were dogs, slaves and wool and cloaks. So Did he find that unusual that common folk committed themselves to in slavery to the nobles? Was this an unusual thing he found among the British Celts? Or?
I think Caesar is probably talking from the perspective of being, a patrician Roman, and clearly he belonged to a slave-owning society, that of Rome, and when he came to Britain, he found, and when he came to Gaul, he found a strictly hierarchical society where anybody who counted were, they were the knights or the druids or the craftsmen, but everybody else was in an almost sort of serf-like state. And I think he found that was strange. Interestingly, archaeologically, we've got quite a lot of evidence for slave ownership. We have gang chains, for example, from late Iron Age sites in North Wales, in southeast Britain. Slave gang chains, iron chains for 5 or 6 people at a time.
So the chain gang goes back to
absolutely. And
working for the chain gang.
Indeed.
Sing that in Celtic.
Yep. And we actually have a wonderful picture from the National Museum where Cardiff students were put into one of the slave gang chains to see how they actually worked in operation. Very good. And it was very interesting to find how immediately you're in a gang chain, your head goes down, you become a kind of non-person, you become just a body, as it were. And it's unbelievable how defeated, how humiliated being in a gang chain makes you, because you have to behave like everybody else, you have to be in exactly the same position as everybody else. And that kind of gang chain effect, I think you're also finding in some of the Iron Age bog bodies that you get in Northern Europe, including Britain, with ropes around their necks. Again, it's a humiliation thing. And so this idea of degradation, slavery, contempt is something which I think we can find in the material culture and Caesar.
Going from heads down to heads off, Alistair Moffat, there was a great culture of decapitation in battle. One of the first things, not one of the first things, but one of the things the Roman writers observed that after great battles, when the Gaulish Celts swept in, they decapitated their enemies, they scoured the skulls, they gilded them sometimes, turned them they put them in fences to ward off their enemies' ghost skulls, and so on. What was that all about, and how did it fit in with the druidical aspect of the religion?
I think the reason that they decapitated their enemies was somehow to capture something of their soul, to possess them absolutely. And as you say, many of these heads...
They thought that the head contained the soul.
Yes, I mean, and many of these heads are preserved in oil and so on, and there are tales of Celtic chieftains refusing to give up the head of a defeated warrior for many pounds of gold and so on. It's not something that's exclusive to Celtic society. The Vikings did this too. And there are stories of warriors right into the Middle Ages in the north of Scotland tying heads to their saddles and so on to show that they defeated enemies. So I think it was obviously a trophy thing. In terms of these fences that you talk about, these what one writer's called ghost fences, where priests would use skulls as a method of warding off or keeping out difficult or evil things, that still continues as a tradition. Every Halloween, kids make turnip lanterns.
Pumpkins and turnips,
absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
And they're druidical skulls, in my view, a memory of that, at least.
Can we trace back that heads to go into the Celtic religion? I was using it as an entry point for that as well. Sure. So people think, the Druids, big knives, circles, stabbing, sacrifice. That seems to be sort of right as well, doesn't it?
Well, there are interesting relics of this. I mean, one of the Druids came up in the 7th century at the Synod of Whitby, amazingly, which was organised to discuss the correct dating for Easter, the Celtic dating versus the Roman dating. And
Rome won.
Exactly, Rome won. One of the things they also argued about was the tonsure, the monkish tonsure. Yeah. And
Rome won again.
And Rome won again because they wanted the one that imitated the crown of thorns, as it were.
But to go back to the Druids...
Let me finish this point, because the Celtic tonsure has been shown to have been how the Druids looked.
Oh, really?
Because it was cut from ear to ear over the crown of the head and shaved at the front with long hair at the back. And that's why they rejected it, because it was a pungent whiff of the pagan past.
And indeed there is a representation of the 3rd century BC from Bohemia showing somebody with that Celtic tonsure.
So this is what these men looked like.
Yeah,
but I don't think we should take, the Druids as all blood and thunder and all heads being cut off everywhere.
Caesar gave them great authority, didn't he? He said they laws and settle disputes and move across tribal boundaries and teach young people and astronomy. And he's talking about teachers and leaders, and they didn't do military service, and they didn't pay taxes. They were special people in the community.
Yeah, I think what Caesar does, as Miranda was saying earlier, is that he sort of clumps all sorts of ideas together and sort of half understands them and half presents them. And what he's doing with the Druids is saying that there are a whole range of specialists, sort of vaguely intelligent, judicial, religious specialists. And let's call them all Druids, and let's say they do all this. What he's probably talking about is a whole range of different functions linked to different people. But there is this class of specialist people. Now, what seems to me to be the key that Caesar says in that text of his is that they are the intermediaries between man or people and the gods. And you can't, as an ordinary person, communicate with the gods unless you do it through a druid. So they had enormous power.
Yeah, exactly. But who were the Celtic gods, Barry? And how much did the Celts believe in the Celtic gods?
Well, again, Caesar. We keep on coming back to Caesar. I wish we had a few more good sources.
Is he really reliable?
No. You've got to interpret Caesar. You've got to try and interpret Caesar. He didn't actually understand everything he was seeing, nor did he communicate it accurately. I always think of Caesar's texts being rather like perhaps the letters written by the wife of a missionary in Africa to a maiden aunt back at home. You know, it goes through all these black boxes so that what she is observing and what she's communicating are two entirely different things. But there are grains of truth in Caesar, and that's what we've got to get at. But this intermediary between between people and the gods is very important, and Caesar says, and I do believe this, that and the Druids can excommunicate you, virtually, and make you unclean because they won't let you communicate with the gods. And if they do that, you're actually outside society. So it's very powerful.
Yeah, and they won't let you come to sacrifices, which is the great punishment. But who are these gods, Alistair?
One of the things that the Celts do is they climb hills. And that's interesting. And on the top of hills, they build these enclosures. There's a huge one on top of Eildon Hill North in the Borders, which may have enclosed as many as 500 hut stances. And they build fires on these hills. And the place names that Miranda was talking about remembers this. I mean, Tinto Hill in the south of Scotland is from the word chaina for fire. Fire hill is what it means. And they built these fires at festival points, at points in the calendar which were important to them as stocksmen and as farmers. And these 4 festivals occur, at sensible. I mean, Halloween, if you like, is a memory of one of them. Hence the attachment of the turnip lanterns and so on. It's a very wispy and hard to catch memory. So they climb hills, they light fires, and they do a whole range of things, as Barry said. One of the things about the Celtic priestly class that characterises them is an absolutely prodigious memory.
I'll come into that in a minute. I'm still trying to get after these gods. It's obviously quite difficult to get any gods. So for the third time of asking,
ask Miranda.
I think both the literary evidence and the archaeological evidence give us a handle on the Celts as being people who believed in spirits of place. They believed in a multiplicity of divinities in all aspects of nature. So there would be sky gods, there would be water gods, there would be mountain gods, there would be fire gods, there would be sun gods. And there is quite a lot of archaeological evidence for this. And one of the most important pieces of archaeological evidence is the veneration of water, shown by the deposition of important, prestigious objects, often military objects, into water, into marshes, rivers, lakes, and so on. And this goes on throughout Europe. Often these weapons are ritually broken to send them over into the other world and to generate a force by the breaking. They're then cast into water and sacrifices are made to the gods.
So, and as Alistair pointed out in his book, Excalibur is a sort of lovely relic of that coming out of the lake and being thrown back into the lake and so on. But what do these gods do? And what if I were a Celt? What would the gods do?
They're interactive.
What do I get from them? What do they want from me?
You enter into a kind of contract with the gods. So that
do they have names?
Well, we can back project from the Roman period when the Roman period gives us Celtic god names on inscriptions.
So they've got names.
They've got names.
Right.
We don't know how far we can back project those names into prehistory. But there is one particular god who's mentioned in classical sources like Lucan, a god called Taranis. He's a thunder god, he's a sun god, he's a sky god.
What do I do for him, or him for me?
You will probably say to him, I want to pray for you. I'm very anxious that there'll be a good harvest this year. If I sacrifice this or that animal, or even this or that human, to you, I will expect in return a good harvest. And you will also indulge in aversion sacrifices. So, for example, if you wanted to make quite sure you weren't going to be defeated in battle, you wanted to ward off something bad happening, you would have a sacrifice in anticipation of that event.
Barry, then Alistair.
Just to follow on what Miranda says, we've actually got hard archaeological evidence for this. I was excavating some years ago an Iron Age hill fort called Danebury down in Hampshire, and we found there large numbers of grain storage pits, where silos, underground silos, where people would have stored their seed grain and putting it in the realms of the deities of the underworld, the chthonic deities, for safety in this liminal period between cropping it and sowing it. And then you take it out and you sow it. What you want to do is to have a contract with the gods to make that fertile. So you put an offering, and we find these offerings in the bottoms of the grain storage pits, and you might put a cow or a dismembered horse or even a piece of an ancestor or some horse gear or something in the bottom of the pit. And then quite often we find that slightly later on in the year, when the harvest presumably comes in, you put another offering in, which is the thank offering. So one is propitiating the deity saying, please, and the other is propitiating the deity saying, thank you.
Can we come to the oral culture now, Alistair Moffat, which is something that is a kind of despairing aspect, really. We have this great civilization. We hear these fragments and shards, and they didn't write it down. We know that we are told that 300 stories could be remembered by some of the reciters or priests, which is quite easy to believe. I used to think that was a terrible, difficult thing to believe till I got to know some very good classical actors in this country, and their memories are prodigious. So that can be held. So I believe all that. But they didn't write it down. So, A, why didn't they? Briefly, and B, more importantly, where does that leave us in discovering as much about them as makes real sense?
I think the Romans were unusual in that they did write things down. Many cultures didn't write things down, not just the Celts. I mean, I think the almost obsessive nature of recording things, particularly after the period of the Empire, makes the Romans different. So I think the Celts were not unusual in that sense. The difficulty, as you say, is that there's nothing on paper. But why do we always trust things on paper? I mean, who would look at the Sun newspaper as a reliable record of anything?
That's getting away from the point.
No, it's not.
Well, actually, lots of people wrote things. Really, in effect, the Egyptians wrote things down, the Greeks wrote things down, the Assyrians wrote things down, the Romans wrote things down. And the Celts didn't. I mean, let's take it as a useful starting point. They didn't write things down. Now, so lots of people didn't, so that'll do for an answer. Now, what do you think we've lost by them not writing things down?
Well, clearly we've lost stories. That's something which we don't have. I mean, we haven't got a Tacitus, we don't have a Caesar. We're reduced to always making comments about the Celts from the outside, often asking questions which are asked from the outside and answered from the outside. So you rarely get an absolutely authentic meeting, as it were, from that culture. Because it's been remembered, that is why the languages are so important to me, because they carry the stories inside them, in terms of attitude, in terms of systems for thinking about the world. If you want to know more about Scotland, learn Scots Gaelic, because it will tell you about that country in a way that English can only do so partially. And the same is true in Wales and Ireland, and in Manx, in Man and Cornwall.
Yes, sure, you have an example where the many descriptions of the brownness of a cow, is it?
Absolutely. I mean,
yes.
There's a cattle owning society, a society obsessed by cows in some ways. I mean, some of the earliest epics, the Tyne Bo Cúailnge is about stealing a bull from the King of Ulster. And when people in Ireland in the early period want to compare their power, they count their cows. So cows are very important. And the ability to recognise 20 different colours of cow is very important, and the language is very sophisticated in that regard. It's not sophisticated in other ways, particularly so far as the modern period is concerned, but it also describes nature, the natural world, very, very well, because that was important too. Weather was vital. Can I come to this? Are you sticking with the oral history point?
Yes, can I for a while?
Yeah, please. Yes,
you mentioned, Alistair mentions the Tyne, this great Irish epic. Now, here is a piece of folk tradition that was remembered and passed down and modified generation after generation. The 8th century AD version was eventually written down about the 12th century by monks and emasculated still further, but we do have it written down. And this is a great pan-European epic which reflects cattle raiding and all those things. The Irish, modern Irish, have said, this is ours, this is our history. I think that's not quite right. It's European. It's a European epic, a great European epic, of which we have one Irish version, but we do have it, and it's an amazing text about life in the past.
That takes us to something that we've held off from, but it's actually the first way that people recognise the Celts when they're writing about them, which is to do with raiding, their warrior qualities. I mean, that was the Romans spoke with awe of their warrior qualities, of their bravery, they would go naked into battle, even if all the odds were against them, and they would still go. Can we just talk about that? And this idea of war rage and rage fit they got themselves into beforehand. Would you like to start with that?
Yes, I mean, one of the things about the Greek and Roman writers about the Celts is that clearly it would have been in a war situation where they would tend to meet them, and therefore that would be sort of uppermost in their minds. And we get this picture from the classical writers of groups of Celts who were much bigger, much taller, much fairer than the Romans, and different, and fought differently, and fought very much as individuals rather than as part of a massed army. So a complete contrast with the sort of very disciplined Roman forces. You get these individualistic, bombastic, flamboyant people, dripping with jewellery and body paint, and whirling, great swords around their heads and so on, and being very, very fierce and frightening. And the archaeology, to an extent, does endorse this. I mean, I think it tends perhaps to distort our picture of Celts, because what has survived in terms of the archaeology tends to be the flamboyant, the rich metalwork, the horse harness, the swords, the shields, the spears, that kind of thing. But certainly, if you look at a lot of high status graves in Britain, in Iron Age Celtic Britain, one of the marks of status will be that you're buried with your chariot, perhaps, and your sword, your spear, and that would be something very important. So, and all of that has come to give us this picture of this sort of war. This war culture. Strabo actually says the Celts are war mad.
Yeah,
but we can get behind that a bit, because here again we've got the classical world looking at something they don't understand and trying to explain it. If you look at it anthropologically, what we're seeing is endemic warfare. Which is the norm for most of the world most of the time, where warfare is part of the social system in the Celtic world. And there were two forms of warfare. One was the raid, where you built your own status by going out and pinching someone's cows or slaves or wives or something like that. And there are plenty of examples of that. But the other is the kind of battle that Miranda was talking about, where the two armies come together, they face each other, and they put out their heroes, and their heroes yell abuse and I'm the greatest and all the rest of it.
They boast a lot, don't
they?
They
boast.
Yeah.
Then they go into
they
battle
lot,
in front of the two armies.
The origins of the work.
See you up there with
the word goes back to the... It doesn't matter. I'll talk about something.
And so you've got these two, the heroes fighting in front of the two armies, and then when one lot of heroes fight, someone dies and they go back, and the next heroes come out, and so on. It's competition. It's controlled warfare. Sometimes it goes wrong, and the two armies fight. But normally it doesn't. Normally in the sort of Celtic warfare, it is display and heroes, just like the football matches now. Football match is an exact parallel to this sort of endemic warfare.
It'll take too long.
But it's just like David and Goliath. It's exactly the same in the Old Testament.
Yeah, exactly. The heroes coming out and shouting and doing. But the Roman, they made a different sort of.
That's right.
They made a different sort of
they
way
had
to
to
play
modify
the big
their
war.
techniques as soon as they met the Romans.
But Alice, can we talk a little bit more about this war before we maybe have time for one last Larry? And the rage fit and the way of steaming us, which I'd like to ally with the idea of history that they had, if this doesn't seem too ridiculous, was that it all came through people acting, men and women acting. It wasn't movements. It was to do with history. It was to do with this man doing that man doing that woman doing that, because women featured. We haven't got to that, I'm afraid, but women did feature very strongly in Celtic
That's right.
affairs.
That's right. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the comments that you get from classical writers about their bellicosity, about their war madness, is that they actually admire them. They admire their courage, frankly. And that's something that we forget. You hear talk which verges on the kind of crazy, savage stuff. But these people are immensely courageous. And they were able to work themselves up into what these almost transcendent rage fits, the fragarachen, to become, in a Gaelic phrase, beside themselves. People are now beside themselves with anger or whatever. And that's what the Celts tried to do, so that they could nerve themselves to take on this fight or to take on this battle. Classical writers do talk about all-out charges as well, and of course they were still going on at Culloden in 1746, and they're still going on in Ireland in 1798, the all-out, flat-out charge. So this is not recklessness, this is a tradition, as it were. These are quite well understood traditions, and it's to do, I think, with immense courage as much as anything.
Maybe backed up by the fact that they felt that the soul of a dead person moved to another living person. Caesar thought that might be associated with it, but there isn't time for that. Just one thing which I'd feel terrible if I didn't just mention, but just to mention it is even more terrible, Miranda, so I'm on to lose-lose. We know that women featured powerfully there. Women could inherit property, they could inherit power, they could act as druids. We know from Boadicea or Boudica that they could ride in chariots and go to war. Is the reference to women now sort of politically correct and rather we better mention a few women, or was it really important?
I think it was really important, and I think that's borne out very much by the recent discovery of the chariot grave at Wetwang, the very recent one, where we have a very tall, powerful woman of about 35 years old who died with her chariot. She was quite clearly a woman of immense power. We know that from the classical writers that there were women like Boudica, like Cartimandia in the 1st century AD, who were independent, powerful women in their own right. I think it was probably not the norm, but certainly the archaeological evidence shows that women could go right through society in a way which they couldn't in the Greek and Roman world. And that's what's important. The difference between the position of women in Celtic society and in classical society is very profound. In Greek and Roman society, women couldn't even be citizens. It's quite clear that in Britain and in France, women could be very powerful and very important.
Would you agree with that, Barry?
Yes, absolutely. And particularly in Britain, strangely enough. We've got more evidence for it in Britain than in any other part of the Celtic world.
Yes.
Briefly, have you any accounting for that, Alistair?
I think it's basically because as far as the Celtic society was concerned, although there were slaves, although there were kings, although there were priests, there's unquestionably a sense where it's a community, and that still survives. The Protestant religion that's been very powerful in the West has rather suppressed the position of women in recent times, but in the past I think that wasn't the case.
Well, thank you all very much. I enjoyed that. I'm sure a lot of people listening did. They'll tell us if they didn't anyway. Barry Cunliffe and to you, Miranda and Alistair. And we'll be back next week discussing virtue with the philosophers Roger Crisp, Miranda Fricker and Galen Strawson. Thanks for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.